Welcome back, everybody. Well, protests continue in the streets and in our institutions when it comes to fighting anti-Black racism. But more and more, this conversation is shifting towards looking at ourselves. Today on the show, we've got educator and author of the New York Times best-selling book, Me and White Supremacy, Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor. So honored to have Layla Saad on the show today. Welcome, Layla.
Thank you. So honored to be here.
I have such a connection to your book because I am going through this, what I call workbook, doing the personal work right now. And the title is what first captured me because Me and White Supremacy is a very evocative, provocative, controversial title. Why choose that?
I think it's one of those titles that either way you're going to feel something when you see it. And that's always great. But really, for me, about being able to name the systems of oppression that we're talking about. If we just say implicit bias or unconscious biases, we're not really naming what we're talking about. And so I wanted people to be able to locate themselves in the system. And I also wanted them to understand it's not about racists are bad people, the rest of us are good, and so this has nothing to do with us, but really understand this impacts all of us in various ways, and we all have to take responsibility for it, especially those who have white privilege.
So, Layla, when people of color do what you're talking about, name white supremacy, sometimes they are met by you're playing the race card, which assumes that the playing field is level. Can you speak more to that?
Absolutely. The playing field is not level, but those who have white privilege who are white are not used to having conversations around race because white supremacy creates white privilege, and white privilege means you don't have to talk about race because race isn't an identity and an experience where you face discrimination or marginalization or abuse. You don't have to worry, am I going to be killed by a police officer because I'm white? And so race is something that many white people feel uncomfortable talking about because it brings up feelings of shame, confusion, anger, discomfort. So the usual retort is, you're playing the race card.
Let's talk about someone's intention versus the impact of their actions. And as you just alluded to, there are people, people who are white who don't often or ever talk about race, who begin to feel defensive when race discussions happen, because for some, they feel like their goodness is being questioned. And you go there in your book. So talk to us about how someone's intent, perhaps it's good, is very different than the impact that they may have in their world around them.
That distinction between intent and impact is so key to understanding how to talk about race and how to understand yourself as somebody who's racialized. If you understand racism as intentional, consciously chosen acts of violence or meanness or discrimination, most people don't self-identify with that. That's not what they're doing. And so they can't see how they are part of this. I really ask people to separate their inherent worthiness and their inherent goodness as something completely separate to systems of oppression and privilege. You could be, the kindest, nicest, most generous person in the world, but because you haven't examined your unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs and behaviors, you could be causing great harm to Black, Indigenous people of color. I think if we use the example of Amy Cooper, I'm sure she wouldn't self-identify as a racist, right? But and in other areas of her life, she's probably a very good person. But in that scenario, all of her unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs and behaviors jumped to the forefront, and that impact was greater than her intention.
You actually, on that point, Layla, ask readers to consider their racial stereotypes. And then you go one step further and you pinpoint the difference between racism and prejudice. Can you tell us what that is?
Because people will sometimes say, well, that's reverse racism, right? I grew up around Black people, I'm white. I grew up around people of color, and they always teased me or discriminated against me because I was the only white person. You may have experienced prejudice, but you haven't experienced racism, because racism requires prejudice, but it also requires power. And when I say power, I mean systemic, institutional, social power that allows you to be able to negatively impact the other person of another race in ways that they can't do in the reverse. So Black people collectively, we may have prejudices against people of other races, but Black people collectively do not have enough power to actually significantly cause harm to people of other races.
Oh boy, that is so profound what you just said there. I approach this book as a white passing, non-Black person of color. And so you talk a lot in this book about people who have different levels of marginalization. So if you are part of the LGBTQ plus community, or you are disabled, as an example, and you go into the area of really examining that you yourself could be oppressed, but could also be an oppressor. So take
Yeah,
us through
yeah.
that.
Yeah, because we're not one-dimensional human beings, right? We have many different identities and many different experiences. Within white supremacy, I'm a Black Muslim woman in the world. Within white supremacy, I may experience oppression under being Black. So for race, my religion, I experience Islamophobia, and my gender, I experience sexism. But I'm also straight. I'm also able-bodied. I'm also middle class, right? And so in those areas, I don't experience oppression, and I have the ability to be able to cause harm to people who don't have those privileges. And so when we can stop seeing ourselves as one-dimensional and really be able to identify all of our privileges and all of our identities and experiences, then we can act more empathetically and be really aware of how we could be causing harm in ways we may not be consciously thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Layla, we see the word diversity used a lot when it comes to institutions, corporations, and often people will point to their boards and say, look, we're diverse. And what that diversity means is women, and primarily white women. Is the word
Yeah.
diversity even the correct thing to use anymore?
I don't know if it's the correct word or not the correct word. What I do know is that it's important for us not to use wording that makes it seem as though we are being, a favor is being done for allowing us to be at the table. Diversity, when we're talking about different people of different identities being present, it should be a norm and not something that some people get to open the gate to and say you're allowed in because we said you're allowed in. And so I think it is worth questioning the wording that we use, but it's also important to think about when we have the look of a diversity, does that look translate over to do those people have power? It's easy to look diverse by changing your branding or hiring people even, but are they treated the same? Are they paid the same as their white peers? Do they have power to speak up? Do they experience gaslighting in the workplace? Are they told they're pulling the race card when something pops up, right? And so it's not about getting numbers in, but it's really about, is the environment there one of equity?
Again, whoo, got to digest that again. Urgency right now, because the world really seems like the conversation in the world seems like it's shifting, and it's shifting quickly, and the work of self-work is now more urgent than ever. But you actually say that that doesn't necessarily mean it has to happen quickly or overnight. And in fact, you say this is in fact the time to slow down in our self-examination. Why do you say that?
Well, I think we're holding two things at the same time, like with many things in this conversation. This work is urgent because we are past due. Racism shouldn't exist. It should never have existed. The people who have been impacted by it for centuries should never have been impacted by it. And so we are behind, and that's what creates that urgency. And at the same time, we understand right now that people are going through, there's a mass consciousness awakening that's happening, but people are not taking the time to really slow down and look within, but are really looking at what's the quickest, easiest, and least painful way for us to create the kind of world that we want to see. And this work is not going to be easy, and it's not going to be painless, and it's not going to be simple. And so people do need to slow down, because it's multi-generational work that we're doing here, just like racism has a multi-generational history. And so, yes, it's urgent, because we shouldn't be in this place in the first place. And you're going to be doing this work for the rest of your life. So pace yourself, and stop trying to find the easiest, quickest way to get to the world that we want to see.
Speaking of the work, Layla, it's been less than a month since the death of George Floyd was circulated literally around the world and incited an international call to action. Do you see this as a moment, or do you see it as a movement, something that is on the cusp of real change?
I definitely feel we're in both right now at the same time. I think this moment that we're in is unprecedented in our lifetimes. We're seeing something we've never seen before, not just in terms of the protests and the movement in the United States, but across the entire world. And people are having conversations in countries, including the one that I live in, around what do we need to understand about this moment? How does racism show up here? How does anti-Blackness show up here? So it is definitely a moment, but it is a movement, because, again, this work has been ongoing for centuries. There have always been people doing social justice, racial justice work. There have always been people sacrificing their time, energy, mental health, and physical life for this movement. And I think it's so important for us to honor that, because while many people may be waking up right now, it's new to them, but this movement is not new.
Layla, your book is called Me and White Supremacy, Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor Essential Reading, an essential audiobook if you can't get the book, because it's you who's reading, which is even better. Layla, what an honor and a pleasure to have you with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back right after this.